welcome Mr. Snowden from Winnipeg, or Ed. Can we call you Ed? Please. All right. The floor is yours, sir.
Thank you. First off, I'd like to extend my gratitude to all of you for coming tonight to talk about a number of different topics that are critically important, but often invisible or hidden for one reason or another. They're only brought to our attention in passing, in the context of a scandal here or there. But these all fit into a larger context that affect our lives every day in every way. And it's important, most important to remember, I think, that the story is not over. History is happening every day, and at no moment is this more clear than right now. I'll share with those of you who have not yet heard a bit of breaking news. In my country, the United States, the director of the FBI was just fired by the president, Donald Trump. This is alarming, and it should cause concern for everyone because the United States, for better or worse, regardless of how you feel about politics, is considered to be a very stable country. It is defined by its adherence to the rule of law. We have a long history of traditions and protocol, and typically we would like to think, at least, that we have an image of being a fairly predictable society. Unfortunately, this calls into question our commitment to the rule of law. It's not to say that what the president has done is illegal, but we should not lose sight of the fact that for whatever reason, under whatever justification or context is provided, the President of the United States has just fired the man in charge of a criminal investigation into the actions of his administration and his associates. Now, when we think about what this means in the global context, it's that unfortunately this is not an isolated occurrence. We see a creeping disrespect for the public and their rights in many countries, including those that we would consider to be above and beyond this. Countries that are well-developed liberal democracies, what we would consider to be open societies, such as the United Kingdom, which passed in the last year what's considered the most extreme surveillance bill, the most intrusive violation of the home and people's private communications in the history of Western democracy. Now, these things that we see, and they happen in authoritarian states as well. Russia recently passed what's called the Yorovaya. Russians call this the Big Brother law. And to put it simply, if Russians are freaking out over a surveillance bill and calling it the Big Brother law, that should raise concerns and make it pretty clear just how serious these things are. In aggregate, these movements are creating a kind of closure of the traditional commons of public debate, the area that defines the boundaries of our rights and what we can discuss openly and freely, the things that we can say without leaving records, things being monitored and reported, saved, without regard to whether or not they violate the law or violate norms, so long as you're not doing anything wrong, so long as you're not harming anyone, it is presumed that we are left alone to our own business. In fact, the right to privacy, traditionally throughout history, has been called the right to be left alone. Now, this narrowing of our rights, these new and modern threats that we see increasing today, where the weight of great actors, powerful, privileged members of society, be they corporate, be they governmental, are starting to threaten these areas of simple inquiry or private association or more. This should be particularly alarming for those in the academic and university space. I argue this because when we look throughout history, at least the modern and semi-contemporary era, every great progressive movement began with the thoughtful. It began with the writers. Revolutions typically grew out of student movements. They were the ones who could take to the streets, who were passionate about it, who lit the spark that ignited the passions in the rest of society. And when we see these times of trouble begin to emerge, we very shortly thereafter see crackdowns, whether direct and dramatic and aggressive, which are relatively rare, but always well remembered, or the more common, but in fact similarly troubling, quiet pressure, whether it's threats against funding, pressure via media or social contexts. These are things that begin to chill us in new ways. And we'll get into this a little bit later tonight. I don't want to spend too much time up front when we have questions. But this brings me into our primary topic tonight, which is how is this manifested today? How is it that this happens? And people are still comfortable with it. They haven't been quite alarmed or moved to action in ways that traditionally catalyze the sort of resistance that we would see come from academics and more broadly, ordinary members of society. And for this reason, tonight we're going to be talking largely about surveillance in our lives. This inevitably means we'll be talking about power. Why? Because people are only interested in your communications, your activities, who you talk to, the way you live, your records, indicators of what you value, how you live, how you think, for a reason, the utility that they provide. And outside academia, these structures, these groups, are not after information for information's sake, right? It's not some great love of learning that motivates them. So whether we're talking about Facebook, depending on what ads you see, or something rather more concrete, such as police forces and their growing love of mechanisms such as stingray devices, which we now see being adopted by the Winnipeg, unusually, perhaps extraordinarily, defended by the mayor, who was previously presumed to have in a prior life been a privacy lord. We're seeing that these mechanisms, these groups, are starting to realize that information about individuals, private people, has become a convenient means for attaining a certain power. And that is the power of control. Now, typically, in a democracy, control of the general outline of our society is intended to be exercised by the people, with their will imposed upon these powerful institutions, be they police with their powers of detention, arrest, imprisonment, or in edge cases, even killing, military or spy agencies, or these corporations such as Facebook. Yet today, we've happened upon a problem. Surveillance technologies have begun to outpace our democratic controls. Our ability to impose these regulations, to impose these restrictions and constraints, simply to guide the way that they're applied to us. Now, a generation ago, surveillance was extremely expensive. Governments had to spend huge sums to track isolated individuals. To know someone's location might involve many teams of officers, both in buildings and out on the streets, working in shifts throughout the day. But now, that dynamic has reversed. A guy sitting in front of a monitor can now track with precision an unimaginably large number of people. This was, in fact, my job in my last position at the NSA in Hawaii, working directly, personally, with the tools of mass surveillance. This is where I saw the ultimate end game of how all of these tiny infractions, these tiny pressures against our rights, result ultimately in something larger. I saw that for the first time in human history, it is now both technically and financially feasible for governments to track and sort nearly complete records of all of our private lives. And this is without having to specifically target or watch anyone. This is what the government prefers to call bulk collection, which is a polite euphemism for what the public broadly and more honestly describes as mass surveillance. Now, this is not science fiction. This is happening now. This is the Utah data center for the National Security Agency in the United States. It's one of the largest data centers in the United States, which is a very developed country. Or at least, perhaps we like to think of it before. This was described as the massive data repository internally. Now, far be it from the NSA not to think about the PR impact these things might have when they hit the front page. And so they thought, massive data repository, that sounds bad. If people learn about this, they might object. Why don't we rebrand it? Well, they kept the data center, which is collecting all of this data. It's being sort of stolen as it crosses the wires of ordinary people's communications. It don't fall under any criminal suspicion. And it falls in these giant reservoirs, which the government can, not necessarily does, but can, then sift through any given period of time. They renamed it the Mission Data Repository, Mission Data Center. It sounds better, but the functional difference is minimal. The problem is that if this is happening in the United States, which has traditionally been considered a leading democracy, the United Kingdom is passing extreme surveillance laws, how then do we pressure and influence and shape groups that most would agree have much more limited human rights protections? How can we criticize the Russian government and its abusive, completely indefensible surveillance programs, or those of the Chinese, when we ourselves are violating those same rights simply in different ways, or perhaps by different degrees? These problems no longer exist only far away in other countries behind the Iron Curtain. And this is a sad lesson of the last few years. The American government, like all governments, did not ask for permission when it sought to launch into this new and unprecedented scale system of mass surveillance. Instead, rather, they deployed these capabilities in secret, even when they knew that these programs were unlawful or unconstitutional, perhaps even because they knew this. And these efforts were enabled because of unusual failures in our intended mechanisms for constitutional oversight. Right? Like many countries, we have a sort of a separation of powers, right? We've got the judiciary, we've got the legislature, and we've got the executive. But our legislature knowingly permitted national security officials to brazenly lie to the public without consequence, despite this being a felony, or even correcting the record. The most senior intelligence official in the United States was brought into the halls of Congress, required to tell the truth and nothing but the truth, again, under threat of criminal sanction. And one of the leading senators, a senator who's on the Intelligence Oversight Committee, asked him, is the NSA spying on ordinary Americans? Is mass surveillance a real thing? And that exchange looked something like this.
Does the NSA collect any type of data at all on millions or hundreds of millions of Americans?
No, sir.
It does not.
Not wittingly. There are cases where they could inadvertently, perhaps, collect, but not wittingly.
You may have noticed he was sweating a little bit, rubbing his hands in the exchange, and that's because he knew what he was saying was a lie. He was provided the questions more than 24 hours in advance. He was on camera in front of the American people, and critically, the senator asking the question knew that his response was false, because this senator, unlike the majority of senators in the country, was read into this program. He knew what was happening. The senator did not correct the record, and he's one of them that does. The director of national intelligence did not correct the record. The only people who were deceived by this exchange were ordinary members of Congress and every ordinary member of society, member of the voting public, who was misled by this. Now, the courts had a chance to review these programs. the largest civil liberties organization in the United States, called the American Civil Liberties Union, and tested in the courts. The day sort of a new law that the government argued would authorize this kind of mass surveillance, but everybody else said did not, they challenged it, got it all the way to the Supreme Court, and regrettably, the Supreme Court flushed the case. They said that, well, it's a very interesting controversy, and it's very likely that the government's activities are unlawful or unconstitutional. If what you're alleging is true, you can't prove it, because these programs are happening in the dark. They're classified. So what happens if the public can be lied to by its own government without consequence, on camera under oath, in the Congress or the Parliament? The same thing can happen in the government's declarations to the courts. The executive themselves, the President of the United States, the most senior intelligence officials, can lie either blatantly or carefully to conceal these activities, which have a fundamental impact on the design of our systems. And the only people who don't know are those who appoint the government itself. Because if there's one fundamental thing about democracy upon which we can all agree, it is that it is founded on a single concept, the consent of the governed. By voting, we provide a mandate that those who campaigned on a platform of certain policies should represent our interests by pursuing these. But if all of these officials can lie to us, and we're never told about it, our votes become meaningless. Because consent is only meaningful if it's informed. So what do we do when ordinary oversight breaks down? What happens when even the most well-designed systems of checks and balances fail comprehensively? This, I would argue, is where we're forced to rely upon democracy's safeguard of last resort, before the state, meaning our press, in alliance with whistleblowers, which are more traditionally referred to as simply the sources of journalism, or journalistic sources. Unfortunately, we are seeing precisely that ability of journalists to operate free from interference, even in what are traditionally considered liberal and open societies, such as Canada, become endangered. Now, police and intelligence forces are increasingly considering investigative journalism to be a kind of threat. Their own classified documents revealed in the wake of the 2013 NSA revelations showed journalists were being ranked between hackers and terrorists on the matrix of threat to national security, right? So they go, okay, yes, investigative journalists, they're not as bad as terrorists, we'll give you that. But they're actually worse than hackers. Why? What's the basis for this? Well, the government's reasoning is that when hackers steal information, only a few people learn about it. Their secrets are still kept from the vast majority. But journalists, they share things with the world, the public, that can shape policy, that can create pressures for reform. This changes things in new ways, and therefore, that's actually a greater concern for them. Now, I mentioned Canada, and people might be skeptical about that, wondering, oh, do they truly do that? But we saw just in the closing months of the last year, the Montreal Police Department had been surveilling the iPhone of a particular journalist, Patrick Lagacé, specifically to identify or to find the identities of his sources, which they suspected, I believe, had helped him write articles that they considered critical or problematic. Now, they had gotten a number of warrants, 24 over time, that allowed them to even turn on the GPS of his phone or get the records of it to see where he traveled, who he was associating with. We see the same thing happening in Australia, where the Australian Federal Police were using what they called subscriber checks to get the phone records secretly under counterterrorism things that are publicly justified in the debate for saving lives, to find out who the sources of inconvenient journalists are and to arrest them. We see organizations such as the GCHQ, which is the British version of the NSA, have been capturing emails from the top international media organizations, places like the BBC, the New York Times. We saw that CSIS admitted in Canada, your intelligence services, say that reporters may have been under surveillance in the past, and they assured that they would answer whether this was true or not in the near future. But they actually reversed this at the 11th hour and said they could not confirm or deny whether it was in fact happening, which, speaking as someone who's been inside that world, I can translate quite simply to say means yes, and unfortunately it's bad enough that it would be quite problematic if it was the facts. Therefore, we have to decline to do that now. So this raises inevitably the question, what if they succeed? Right? What if all of these extraordinarily powerful organizations are able to counter the threat of investigative journalism? If we only knew what governments wanted us to know, then we wouldn't know very much at all. What do you think about it? Can you think of a case recently in which our government and government knowingly violated the law, whether domestic or international, for fear of consequence or embarrassment or any other reason, sought to keep it from the public? Think about what we would know without having that lever of adversarial journalism. We don't have to be talking about national security specifically. What about official footage, such as dash or body cameras from police shootings or protest scenes? When we do talk about national security, things get dark very quickly. We ran an officially sanctioned program of torture in the United States, which again is traditionally considered an open society, a free society with a developed system. Now that's the finding of the US Senate, right? Not conspiracy theory, not some out there lefty liberal outlook, not some conservative pipe dream. These are established facts. But these facts were not made public out of the goodness of the hearts of government. That story was first written by journalists. And unfortunately, the only person who has ever gone to prison on account of that CIA torture program is the CIA whistleblower who confirmed it on TV, confirmed the existence of the program. Okay, let's back out from that and start to summarize. Many would argue, okay, right, surveillance is out there, it has social costs. But these extraordinary powers are necessary for protecting us, to keep us safe. Perhaps this is true. But we should always be aware that we don't get to choose what we are to be protected from. I'd like to draw your attention to a case written by a professor at Georgetown University. His name is Alvaro Amendoya. And this is a case of, again, government investigating radicals, where the FBI, who again, today their director was fired, was looking at a particular individual. This was a religious leader, community advocate that had been in contact with what they considered to be sleeper agents of foreign powers. The Attorney General of the United States was briefed and personally approved wiretaps of this man's home and offices, even though he was a U.S. citizen, the son of a well-known and respected cleric. Even though he's an American citizen, he's placed on a special watch list to be detained in the event of martial law and national emergency. And of all similar suspects, all threats to national security that the FBI was tracking, the head of their domestic intelligence department said this man was the most dangerous from the standpoint of national security. Does anyone know this case? It was Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., the greatest civil rights leader in the history of the United States. And that assessment, that he was the greatest threat, he was the greatest danger, he was what the public should be protected from, was made 2 days after he gave his I Had a Dream speech. This was his most famous speech, and truly transformed race relations in the United States. It is for this reason that I ask that we all reject from our vocabulary terms like national security, because they mean very different things or politicians than they do to you and I. These are euphemisms that mean things such as political stability, more so than public safety. They're intended to popularize concepts and programs that could not be justified in plain language with common definitions. This leads us back to our modern world. We're witnessing the construction of a world in which the most common political value is fear. From Washington to Moscow, from Beijing to Berlin, we're all too frequently hearing the most powerful officials arguing that we're living in the midst of an era of unprecedented danger, that the threats we face today are greater than they have ever been, and therefore, things must change. Our way of life must change. Our rights must change. Now, since the turning of the millennium, this last decade particularly, this has given rise to that creeping authoritarianism that we see drawn into such sharp relief in the news stories that pass every day. A belief that the single most important factor in determining the future direction of our society are the desires of governments, where the morality of a given thing is far less important than the simple lawfulness of it. This is a concept called legalism. If it's legal, it's appropriate, it's fair game. No one has anything to justify, no one has anything to apologize for. Our hard-won prohibitions against concepts such as torture, assassination, indiscriminate surveillance are being overturned or ignored on the basis of nothing more than claims that these actions, these exceptions are necessary because the times are so dangerous. After all, when you live in a world of terrorists and madmen, a world where your nearest neighbor is potentially some covert foreign enemy, rights become a vulnerability. But ladies and gentlemen, I disagree. If our strategy to defend against each new threat is to do away with the very values that in previous years differentiated us from them, the good from the bad, the free from the oppressed, we have protected nothing, and we have won even less. We have diminished not only our society, but the very idea of enlightened civilization, which generations were sacrificed to utilize. If we allow the preferences of a few officials operating behind closed doors to replace these basic, fundamental principles upon which our governments, our societies, our nations, our people, our beliefs are founded, we are no longer citizens. We have been reduced to subjects. We must never forget that there are limits to what can be authorized by law. The father of the idea of civil disobedience, an American philosopher named Henry David Thoreau, argued this specifically. He argued this is a duty that rests upon the shoulder of every individual, saying, it is not desirable to cultivate a respect for the law so much as for the right. The obligation which I have to assume is to do it any time when I think right. Law never made men a whit more just, and by means of their respect for it, even the well-disposed are daily made agents of injustice. Or simply, he's saying the law is no substitute for conscience. Saying so does not make us anarchists. It makes us realists. Certainly, one need not look very far back in history to find examples of abuse and inhumanity that were clearly wrong. And yet at the same time, we would do well to remember that from these violent institutions, slavery, genocide, disenfranchisement of women, to more modern prohibitions as to who and how we can love one another. These policies are more often than not entirely new, and sadly, often even popular. I'm here tonight to say the support of a majority does not transform a wrong into a right. And the dispossessing a minority of basic liberties, or perhaps entire populations of their privacy, does not become permissible simply because it's popular. Sometimes, ladies and gentlemen, we end up in these circumstances. We have to reflect upon the world around us. We have to look and realize and think critically for ourselves about the circumstances that we find ourselves in. We all have a level of injustice, of inhumanity, of inequality that we can tolerate, that we can stand, that we can witness and bear. Turning our head away from the beggar on the street, going, not today. I simply don't have the mental bandwidth to deal with these burdens. But there are other times when we see injustices that go a step too far, when we see that social justice as a concept has itself been placed on the target, right? And we recognize that we ourselves may have power to change that, if only in a small way. If only the only thing we can do is stand up and say something about it, to draw eyes, to draw attention to it. When we find ourselves in these structures, ladies and gentlemen, when it becomes clear that legality, the legality of the thing, and the morality of that thing are two very different concepts, we would do well to remember there are circumstances in which the only moral choice is to break the law. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Ed, for that thorough and insightful analysis of the technologies and the ethics of power and of knowledge. And if anything else, I think it's a ringing endorsement of the need for a critical liberal arts education, which equips us with the tools to delineate and analyze these technologies, the kind of which are fostered here at the University of Winnipeg, Lethbridge, and Brandon University, key liberal arts colleges here in the West. So with that, if it's good with you, I'd like to begin the Q&A period. As I said, these are pre-selected questions from students at each institution, and here at Winnipeg with the Class Institute. So the first question comes from Alison Norris, and she asked, does the rise of neo-fascist politics reflect how contemporary methods of surveillance by the state are used to influence, control, and manipulate its residents? How do individuals, groups, or the population resist or counter that control?
The most important is solidarity. The key to remember is, what is it that makes fascism so threatening? And this is the idea that they take small, extreme groups, right, with very dangerous ideologies, and they bind them together so tightly and create a critical mass that allows them to impose on a larger, more fragmented society the ability to disrupt it and impose values that do not reflect the society, eventually to undermine some more the values of that society. Solidarity, recognizing that even if you are not a part of this targeted mind, if you are not a part of the oppressed class, that you still have a stake in this. By standing up for them, you stand up for a stable society, one which can be fairly influenced, one which can be defended against extreme and radical and dangerous groups, right? Hate groups, more plainly. Now, this is something that's often forgotten, particularly in our hyper-partisan political environment. People subscribe to very narrow sources of others, who you follow on Twitter, right? Who your Facebook friends are, what you like, what you read. You start to create your own filter where you only see certain types of viewpoints, or algorithms, increasingly, from these companies place you in these jars where you're not exposed to them. So it becomes increasingly difficult to sympathize with others. And this, I think, brings us to the central argument made against these core values, which people don't feel in comfortable times. They don't see so clearly why we need rights when they're not using them instinctively. And this is the argument which many have forgotten actually originates with Joseph Goebbels, Nazi propaganda, which is that if you have nothing to hide, you have nothing to fear. But this misunderstands the nature of rights and the nature of privacy. Privacy isn't about something to hide. Privacy is about something to protect. Privacy is about protecting that society, the right to the individual, the right to the self, the right to a free mind, protected from the prejudice of outsiders, the right to make mistakes and not have you even follow you for the rest of your life, the right to hold unpopular opinions and not be exposed to outside criticisms and groups for them unless you choose to share them quite selectively. Privacy, when we think about these things, is the fountainhead from which all other rights derive. For example, freedom of speech doesn't mean that much if you can't really figure it out what it is that you need to say. What it is that matters to you, what you think, what you believe, same for freedom of religion. If you only inherit a faith but cannot determine your own beliefs, your true beliefs for yourself, to test them out, to try them, to embrace new ones, and to be wrong, you'll never truly know them. This is where I think privacy stands as a great example of why these other rights, for example, freedom from unreasonable search and seizure, the right to due process, to be presumed innocent until proven guilty, and so on, these matter to you even if you're not accused of a crime. Because if you're powerful, if you're privileged within a society, if you're not on the X, right, if you're not targeted, if you're not the group that's being acted upon, rights truly don't matter that much to you. If you're Bill Gates, right, or some other rich, powerful individual or politician, you can assert your own rights. You can actually shape and influence the laws of an entire society, sadly, by exploiting the weaknesses in our political systems, campaign spending, and so on. But what if you're a little bit different? What if you're a little bit unusual? What if you don't think the same as everyone else? What if you are a minority? You are the one that rights exist to protect. It is only the vulnerable who truly need rights in the moment, right? But we have to recognize we can all be put in a position of vulnerability. All it takes is a change of ideas, of times, of themes, of popularity, right? Social mores change, they come and go. Who's targeted today won't be targeted tomorrow. But saying things such as, I don't care about privacy because I have nothing to hide, is no different than saying, I don't care about freedom of speech because I have nothing to say. It's short-sighted, it's antisocial, and ultimately self-defeating. What you're saying is, I don't deserve the right to be different. I don't deserve to have a claim on myself. I don't need that because I'm not different. I don't have any individual ideas. I am not an individual. Privacy and all rights in aggregate are about the right to the self, the right to a free mind, the right to have something, anything, if only an idea, if only a belief, if only a friend that no one knows about, for yourself. These concepts are baked into the core of our language, into phrases like private property, right? If you don't have privacy, you don't have you. You don't exist to claim yourself. Rather, society claims you, and you belong to others.
Thank you very much. I'd like to pass things over now to my colleague, Dr. Harold Jansen in Lethbridge, for the next question.
Thank you. Hello, Ed, from everybody here in Southern Alberta. I wish you could have heard the big round of applause here. I enjoyed your speech very much. Here at the University of Lethbridge, one of sort of founding principles or central principles in our strategic plan is the idea of responsible citizens. And that's what we want to do as a university. And I know all liberal education universities see the cultivation of citizens as a central role. One thing that's always struck me about you is that the concept of citizenship runs through what you do. You signed your emails to Laura Quatros with the name Citizen 4. When asked at a TED Talk about whether you should be seen as a hero or patriot or traitor, you said, no, I'm a citizen. So my question is, how do you understand the role of citizens to be? How did that motivate what you did? And how does what you disclosed impact the role of citizens in society?
So, when we think about, and let's start with sort of my individual case. When I first entered office for the CIA, right, as a staff employee of the government, your very first day you come in and you swear an oath. A lot of critics have said, you know, this guy violated his oath of secrecy, but they don't understand there is no oath of secrecy. That's not actually a thing. Rather, the oath you swear is called the oath of service. It's not a loyalty oath to the government, to a particular politician, to the president. It's to support and defend the Constitution of the United States, our basic laws, our Bill of Rights, against all enemies, foreign and domestic. Now, you do have to sign a classified non-disclosure agreement, right? It's a secrecy agreement. But this is a civil agreement, right? When you contextualize this with an oath of service that the government demands that you take to a very high, what we would consider to be moral obligation that is supposed to underlie where our government derives its legitimacy from, any government, suddenly come in conflict. How does one resolve the tension? Now, people might look at this in different ways, and they might come to different conclusions. But I came to the belief that I had a superior obligation and an inferior one. I had one to protect the secrecy of information, which in many cases would be legitimate, right? There was an extraordinary amount of information which I had access to. I could have revealed, but did not. And then there was this smaller universe of information, which was still similarly classified, but was about the violation of people's rights, both within the borders of the United States and around the world. What should be done about this? Should we protect political prerogatives, even surveillance programs, if they're actually breaking the contract with the American people, violating the Constitution to which I swore that oath? Or should we go, look, you know, this was a tough decision, but secrecy loses out when it threatens democracy? I think this doesn't have to be simply in the context of blowing the whistle, right? We talked before about what people witness in their lives, the injustices, right? Whistleblowing specifically is about speaking out. You're not elected president or anything like that, which was why the number of documents that I have published is zero. Rather, I provided documents specifically to journalists to remove my own political biases and decisions from the publication process. And I require as a condition of access to these documents that the journalists say they would publish no story simply because it was newsworthy, no story simply because it was interesting, but only publish stories that they were willing to make an institutional editorial judgment was in the public interest to know. And this was to make sure that they didn't just take my word for it, or even I wasn't calling the shots. I had no influence in this process, and beyond that, to replicate the tripartite system of checks and balances that had failed within my government, where you have the executive, the individual actors, initiating force. You have the deliberative branch, right, which in this case would be journalists. And then you have the final check, branch of argument, which would be the courts. The journalists were required in every case, in advance of publication, to go to to go to the government, the agency whose documents they were publishing, and tell the government what programs they were going to be discussing, what they meant, ask the government for context, either for justification, or to provide the government a chance to rebut the beliefs these journalists held, or argue that the journalists should not publish this story. It would cost lives, place society or some critical program at risk. And in every case, this process was followed. And that's why now, today, in 2017, I believe no one has ever come to harm as a result of these disclosures. And this is backed up, by the way, by the public record of evidence. The Congress of the United States is no fan of mine. They investigated me for more than 2.5 years, and they have never shown any public evidence whatsoever, despite complete access to classified information, that anyone came to harm as a result of these disclosures. Now, this was my attempt to argue that this can be done safely and effectively, even in the most conservative way. That's not to say every whistleblower should follow this process. This is right, others wrong. It was simply my belief and my best effort to do right. I was not elected by anything other than circumstance. Whistleblowers never are. It's not about who you are. It's not about what you know. It's about what you witness. And what you believe. You can change. Now, this is something that applies to our lives, and this, to me, is what I believe citizenship is about. It is not enough to see something wrong in society, to believe that it is wrong, and to believe that things could be better. You can't just believe in something. You have to stand for something if you want things to get better. When you see an injustice, when you see a failure, when you see a potential for improvement, if you want that better world to come into being, it won't happen just by waiting. There are no heroes, right? When I was sitting at the NSA talking to my coworkers and talking about how bad this was and how someone should do something about it, I was hoping anyone would come forward and do it so I could continue living my comfortable life in paradise of Hawaii. That doesn't happen, right? The person that you are waiting for is you. There aren't heroes, right? There are heroic acts that we are all capable of, even if only for an instant. The least among us can make the right decision, and that's all that it takes to make a better world.
Thank you very much, Mr. Snowden. It's a real pleasure to have you here. This is Rick Baker at Brandon University. In recent decades and recent years, we've seen a movement towards a merger of artificial intelligence and the human brain. And we're hoping that you can shed some light and give us your insight into what the implications of this shift, has in terms of our ongoing battle against the invasion of our privacy.
So I don't want to speak beyond my expertise here, but I'll tell you a little anecdote about something that I am aware of. So I've probably read more classified documents and more other things than anybody else who worked for the NSA, because one of the things that I did in my earlier jobs was I automated. So I had very little to do in a productive way during the ordinary course of the day, so instead I read. And this is how I eventually came to see the truth of mass surveillance, to become aware of so many programs that others, colleagues, and specialists themselves did not know. They each saw very deeply their specialization, this part, I had both the unusual clearances by virtue of my position and the time to see the big picture. Now, one of the things that I saw is that the NSA and many groups within the U.S. intelligence community regularly commission private reports, both from academic institutions and private research groups. Right? I have a policy of not revealing classified information myself that has not been previously published by journalists. Right? I want them to make that public interest judgment. But one of these is not actually classified, it was simply private. And this was that the NSA creates technology forecasts through these groups, where they go, you know, what's going to happen in the next decades, so they can try to get ahead of the curve and start wiretapping things before they become big. Understandable. One of the interesting things that they did with these was brain-computer interfaces. And I found this to be an astonishing projection. I think it's very optimistic. But one of these groups said the brain-computer interfaces would be in widespread use in society by 2023. That's, you know, some years off, and I was reading this, of course, back in, let's say, between 2010 and 2013. But it still seems aggressive. But even if it's only used in fringe things, for example, like returning capabilities to disabled, whether we're talking about hearing implants, whether we're talking about ocular implants in the blind, whether we're talking about pacemakers and things like that that are embedded in our bodies that may not have a direct contact with the brain, we're talking about complex systems that may or may not increasingly be network connected. It seems like the trend is toward network connectivity, which I would say is very dangerous from a security context. And this means our own bodies are starting to create records of our activities that could be collected and used by outside groups for better or worse. And then I thought, you know, as interesting as that is, we all have incredibly complex devices that might as well be embedded in our bodies because they're either riding in our pockets or our purses right now. Anyone who is sitting in this room with a cell phone on them is leaving a more or less permanent record of their attendance at this talk. All of your devices, by virtue of the way the cellular networks were designed in, shall we say, more innocent times, are at every moment squawking out into the universe. They're kind of singing, saying, here I am, here I am. They're transmitting a universally unique identifier. No other phone has the same stamp on it. No other SIM card has the same stamp on it. And it's saying this into the air so that the cell phone towers around you can hear you. The problem is the cell phone towers say records of these. This was initially for a beneficial purpose, right? So that they can go, all right, when a particular phone number is dialed, where is that phone in the world? So we don't ring every phone whenever anybody dials a number. Instead, we go, all right, it's at this cell tower, in this area, in this region, in this country. And then of all the phones connected to that cell phone tower, we want to ring only the one that has this cell phone, or sorry, this SIM card, and this, what we call an IMEI, Individual Manufacturer's Equipment Identifier, which is actually burned in the handset, right, of your iPhone and discrete in the SIM card. Now, the phone companies can hold this as long as they want. You don't own the record, they do. And they increasingly, sadly, are storing these kind of records, not just about the phone calls you make, but your travels. In the United States, we see that they're beginning to actually sell these records to governments. Excuse me, I'm trying to find here we go. They're selling these records for profit, even to the police, at a level of legal standard that is lower than what is traditionally required, lower than what we expect. AT&T is the largest, or was at one point the largest phone company in the United States. They're still extraordinarily large. And it turns out they have been storing every call, text message, Skype communication, anything that they could get a record of from these sort of transactions, just the pollution that's thrown off by operating the cell phone network, by you owning the phone in the first place, that goes all the way back to 1987. Right? So if you were an AT&T customer and you're in this room and you were born after 1987, every phone call you had ever made, they still have a record up to this day. And they're beginning to trade it around and sell these to police agencies and things like that. Pass them on lower legal standards. You might not be particularly concerned about that because you go, you know, I have nothing to hide, therefore I have nothing to fear. We'll be addressing specifically that. What you're doing is you're accepting a paradigm that fundamentally disempowers every individual whose life is touched by technology. I don't believe that we should live in a world where every time we carry a phone with us, we have to think about what that's going to look like in a government database, in a corporate database. I don't think every time we pick up the phone and dial a number, we should wonder about how that's going to be adjudicated by some government official sitting behind the desk. Whether or not it actually happens, that is not what living in a free society is about. That is not the kind of future we should be utilizing. And therefore, we should take steps to protect ourselves. But more importantly, we should take political action. We should embrace strongly that principle of solidarity to recognize that even if I do not feel personally at risk because of these things, I recognize that the values of our society are very much endangered by a system of mass surveillance. And for that reason, I say no.
Thank you very much, Mr. Snowden. I'm going to send you back to Dr. Laurie at the University of Winnipeg.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dr. Baker. We have another question here from a class student that is somewhat a follow-up of what you were just discussing there. I'm personally going to return to the can on a string or the carrier pigeon industry after hearing that notion about cell phones. The question is from Aaron Demeter. He asks, how can students ensure their privacy and remain anonymous when both the state and corporations want to abolish the privacy of the individual?
Okay. So this is the hard question, the one that's the least satisfying. You know, academics would this would be the point where they would say, it depends, right? But the bottom line is, if we're entering into a fight, you as an individual, with the most powerful intelligence organizations, the best funded corporate actors in the world, that's not a fight we're likely to win, or at least not one that's going to be fair or reasonable. In the United States alone, just one country, the U.S. intelligence community, including military programs, spends more than $75 billion a year, billion with a B, just on intelligence collection. That's far larger than like science foundations and things like that. That's far larger than research spending in not just academic programs, but even corporate marketing programs. And so it raises the question of, can you do anything? The answer is yes. There are two prongs of this, really three prongs. One is practical. What are the simple structures of surveillance and how does it work? There are two large ways that these institutions target people. Again, we're talking about government and corporate. One is targeted surveillance. They look at you as an individual, whether it's your email address, whether it's your name, whether it's your phone number, whether it's your credit card. They need some unique identifier that they use to look at you and aggregate records on that basis. The fewer of these you have that are in observable forms as they transit the internet, the harder you are to observe. Now, whenever you dial the phone, you can't hide who you are calling through traditional means, because the phone company connects the call through that mechanism. But you can protect what you say on the phone, right? When you dial someone, this is what's called a metadata record in sort of the terms of surveillance. These are transactional records. It's the same kind of thing that private eye collects about you as you go about your daily business where they follow you. They can't be close enough to you, right, when you're sitting in a cafe talking to someone to hear every word you say. much like these surveillance agencies can't hear what you're saying on the phone, because you wonder who's this crazy person following me in the cover. But they can see that you went to a cafe. They can see who you met with. They can tell how long you were there. They can tell where you went afterwards. They can tell your means of conveyance. Did you take the bus? Did you take the car? Where you ended up at the and this is analogous to tracking your cell phone's location data and so on and so forth. Where your cell phone goes to rest at night, and what other cell phones go to rest there with you. Even a simple network of calling data with no call content on its own is very valuable analytically because it's understandable to computers. We can make inferences very cleanly. And I can tell things about what we describe in the analysis business were pattern of life. When you wake up, what sites you go to immediately that might be different than other people's that kind of identify you even kinds of things available to us, the others from investigative tools. Who you care about the most based on who you call the most frequently, who you call during periods of crisis, who you call in the middle of the night at unusual times. All of these things can happen instantly, programmatically, automatically, on a constant basis, en masse for everything. Right? The way to limit this, the metadata problem, is we have to divorce the fact that communication occurred between phone A and phone B. This is very difficult. For those who are interested in doing this with internet-based communications, rather than strictly telephony, like phone call records, but who you talk to online, I would encourage you to look at the TOR project, T-O-R, the TOR project. I used this personally when I was engaged in my journalistic activity, right, in 2013, operating as a source. And it worked. Even the National Security Agency was not able to uncover our activities until after we were already in the news. That's not to say that we work 100% of the time. It's not a magic cure, but look at that. The second one, right, is how do we protect the content of those communications? How do we encrypt those phone calls if we can't hide the fact that the phone call occurred in the first place? And this is through encryption. Encryption is basically the mathematical method of turning something very simple into something that is indecipherable garbage unless you have a magical variable. Imagine x plus 1 equals 2, right? But nobody in the world can actually find out that x is also 1. It's a much more complex problem than that, but the idea here is you have to know that variable, which can be a password, it can be a cryptographic secret, it can be whatever. This can then be applied to your pictures, your texts, whatever, and the only person in the world who has that magic variable to understand it, the only people who have this are you and the other party that you're communicating with. If Google has it, if Facebook has it, this is not very reliable. Because if Google can then read your emails, well, Facebook can then read your emails, well, and that's the steps for today. But there are increasingly what are called end-to-end encrypted messages, or zero-knowledge encryption schemes, which means the man in the middle, right, the Google or the Facebook that's connecting this phone to that phone, doesn't have that variable. They can't learn that. So only the two people communicating can read these communications. And the best example of this right now, which you can download, it's free, whatever, is called the Signal Messenger. By Open Whisper Systems, it's on both Android and iOS. WhatsApp is actually still quite good. Unfortunately, the fact that they're owned by Facebook creates some concerns about what they do with metadata of the communication, which is not protected. But we'll limit this here, right? There's a lot of practicalities here. If you really want to know, just search, Edward Snowden privacy recommendations on the internet. You'll find them. The other thing is recognizing I shouldn't have to do this. The idea that I have to armor my tools, that I have to armor web news sites I browse on the internet, that I don't want people to read what I do at the library, simply because I'm exercising my right to inquiry in an open society, I'm going to do something about it. And this is politics, right? A lot of surveillance, from what you just heard in the last couple of minutes, sounds like, technological gobbledygook. It sounds like an elite specialist conversation. It's very difficult to get into. If you are interested in it, I encourage you to develop that interest, to develop your knowledge and participate directly. If you don't have time for that, which is okay, right? We live busy lives, we have obligations, we have families to take care of, we have jobs to go to, we have passions to pursue. Support those who do. Look for civil liberties organizations, civil society organizations, such as the Canadian Civil Liberties Association, CCLA, BCCLI, whatever, any group that is making strides in your country or other countries where this matters, in the world, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, support them, donate to them, give a little bit of your time, give a little bit of your resources, give a little bit of yourself to make them stronger so they can fight for you. And the last, and I would argue most important thing, is to talk about it. Let people know you care. Even if it's not on a stage, even if nobody sees it, even if it's around the dinner table, even if it's in class, let people know that this matters. Right? You may not know what to do about it. You may not know how to solve the problem, but you can say, this isn't right. And, I am for a world where we can be both safe and free, rather than being offered a false choice of one or the other. Because the reality is, if you're not free, you're not safe. And if you're not safe, if you are safe and you're not free, why does it matter? A safe life with no risks at all is called living in prison, right? And I don't know about you, but I don't think that's the model that we want anymore.
I'm going to pass you back now to Dr. Jansen in Lethbridge for our next question.
Thanks. So we passed some cards around, and this was by far the question that was the most popular, so I'm providing several questions here. Your decisions and actions came at a tremendous personal cost to yourself. You went from living in Hawaii, paradise as you describe it, to living in Russia. I haven't been there, but we all live in Canada. We can imagine the difference in weather that you experienced.
Yeah.
Looking back, do you feel the cost was worth it? Do you feel it was justified? If you had the opportunity to do it over again, is there anything you would have changed or done differently?
This is one of those questions that people think about and they come up with an answer that's persuasive to them, and it changes over time. Why and how. But for me, I've never questioned, should I have done it or would I take it back? Because as much as I've lost, I've gained so much more. I believed in my work at the CIA and the NSA. I believed I was signing up for a just cause to do the right thing, and I did my best. And it gave me the opportunity to do that very same thing, to pursue that very same mission in a very unexpected way. The reality is we all have things that we want to achieve in life. And I may not be able to come home, to my family in the United States, lay my head on a pillow in my own stomping grounds. But I can go to sleep every night proud of the choices that I've made and recognize that it doesn't matter what happens tomorrow. I'm satisfied with the choices that I made today. This is something that I think every person, in every way, every small way, every decision that you look at, has to reflect on and consider. We have a finite number of days, we have a finite number of hours, and we don't know how the story ends. But we do know the story of right now. And we don't need to aim to change the law, right? I didn't come forward to change the laws of the United States and tell people what to do. I came forward with one specific, to tell the public that which was done in their name, that which is done against them. It's up to all of you as to what comes next. I'm just the mechanism. My outcome, my result does not matter so much as the fact that we had lost the seat at our table, or so we had lost our seat at the table of government. And now we have it back, if only in a small way. And if together, one by one, we try to achieve that, I'll be home again soon enough.
Mr. Snowden, I want to ask a question that relates to our broader topic about the role of the university as it relates to mass surveillance. Two of the biggest and most visible databases of mass surveillance are Google and Facebook, which originated on university campuses. Given the university's own role in developing technology that permits and encourages mass surveillance, can the university be trusted to make good ethical choices in this ongoing debate?
This is a very complex question. There's a lot of sort of presumptions that we bring into this naturally. One is that corporate surveillance is the same as governmental surveillance. They're both meaningful, but they're different in slightly subtle ways. Google and Facebook, for example, can't jail you. The government can. But does that mean Google and Facebook surveillance is harmless or can't achieve the same effects? No. Because Google and Facebook all too often collaborate with the government, often in, sadly, unrestricted ways. For example, under the most famous sort of NSA program that was created, what's called the PRISM surveillance program, that showed Google, Facebook, Apple, Microsoft, Yahoo, sort of all the largest internet service names that we all know, were cooperating with the NSA far beyond what the law required in the United States. The American government came out and said, look, don't worry about this. There's nothing to see here to the American public, because if you're an American, we need a warrant to do this. But if you're not an American, those legal protections aren't there. They don't need a warrant. All they need is what an analyst reports is what's called a reasonable, articulable suspicion, which is the legal term for saying a gut feeling, that there's something interesting about you, which the term of art we use has foreign intelligence information, right? And they can get to it, even if it's locked behind these corporate reservoirs. But this brings us into that larger context. Okay, so we have these companies that are collaborating with government, and it all gets back to this essential thing of power. We have these large, private, largely unaccountable unaccountable institutions on the private industry side, and sadly in the government side, when you start adding state secrets and privacy, they're no longer accountable to the public in the same way as well. And yet they shape our lives, and yet they influence the way we move through one day to the next. They give us the directions that guide us through the day. They provide the search results to our matters of inquiry. And yet we don't know what's going on. We don't have any influence for them if they go wrong. Maybe they're not. Maybe they're wonderful angels of better nature. Maybe we'll have the most wonderful reforms. Tomorrow we'll enter a golden age in Canada with respect for privacy rights and civil liberties. But those rights end at the Canadian border. The internet is global. So we've got this question of the university. How do we account for a world where laws are no longer a reliable guarantee of rights? Now, this is a provocative question, but it's an important one. Traditionally, law has been our best shield against abuses. It was never perfect, often failing, and long behind the times, particularly for vulnerable populations. But it was something. Now, law can't keep up with it. keep up with corporate exploitation. So what's left? Fundamental laws, natural laws. And I don't mean this in the philosophical sense, I mean this in the mathematical sense, in the physical sense. The internet, all of it, is the transmission of electrons. Computers, all of them, are comprised from atoms. Our mastery of science and technology is an opportunity. It is a new mechanism for enforcing human rights in new ways, beyond borders, right? Because information is so transmissible. If you in this room, thinking about this right now, develop a new system, a new scheme, a new protocol, whether it's for commerce, whether it's for sharing, whether it's communication, whether it's for sending cat pics to your friends, right? This can cross borders instantly, immediately after you share it, after you publish it online. And this can protect rights not just of individuals in Canada, if you bake human rights into your proposals, into your thinking, into your protocols, into your research. It can do the same for those Russians living under this new Big Brother law. It can do the same for Chinese, for people in sub-Saharan Africa, for people in Germany and France and every other place. And that, my friends, is a beautiful opportunity. That, my friends, is where the potential of universities shines brightest right now. These are unsolved problems. Right? These aren't new frontiers. These are challenges we see are real. They're affecting everything. How do we deal with what are, quite frankly, in certain contexts, rapacious corporate appetites for influence, for monetization, for any other completely understandable, if cold and ruthless, corporate aims, right? Or the same typical, historical, repeatedly endless government desires for influence, stability, control, mastery of people's thoughts and the political narratives, the mores, and structure of the status quo. These things are here today, they will be here tomorrow. But we now have an opportunity to recognize the same sword that is being used against our generation can be used as a shield. It can be hammered into a new shape to protect the next. And ladies and gentlemen, I hope, more than anything else, you tonight will have an idea as to how to do that.
Thank you, Mr. Snowden, for that rousing defense of the liberal arts and sciences. I'll send it back to Dr. Laurie at the University of Winnipeg.
Well, Ed, we're just wondering if it's not too early or too late for you, if you would be open to another round of questions, one question each from each of the host institutions.
I would actually love to. I am late for another engagement, but if we can make them quick, let's bang them through right now.
All right, let's keep going. All right, so we will begin here in Winnipeg. This question comes to us from Walter Luzzi. He asked, as information is routinely linked by officials to further their own agenda within government, why should we trust those leaked documents as offering a complete picture, as they are often strategically leaked, I should say, at particular times, such as elections, and the choice of what is leaked reflects a particular agenda. Some examples here being Hillary Clinton's emails or Donald Trump's taxes. I'm sorry it took this long to actually mention the name.
We shouldn't. That's the main thing. I don't ask people to trust me. I don't ask people to trust the documents that were published as a result of the disclosures that I made in 2013. And I don't think that people should for the next ones that come out. But I do think we should trust in the process of journalism, the pursuit of truth. And ultimately, the agenda backing a disclosure is far less important than the facts that are found in pursuit of it. There is no question as to the authenticity at this point of what I revealed in 2013, not because of anything I said, not because of who I was, the fact that I worked at an asset, not because of the stories that the journalists initially reported, but because of the follow-up. Because the journalists from every institution and every newspaper around the world went to the government for comment. They showed the evidence, the raw, direct evidence, rather than allegations, of what was going on, and asked for a response, for comment, for justification. And they found out that this was confirmed by governments. The courts investigated these things and found out that these programs were real, they're actually happening. Even the president himself in the United States, no sort of fan of mine, appointed 2 independent commissions in the wake of the June 2013 revelations to say, you know, are these programs effective? Are they really happening? What's going on? Are they saving lives? Because that's what we've been saying. We've been saying, yes, we're violating your rights this way or another. We won't say we're violating your rights, but we are collecting all of these phone conversations without a warrant. We're collecting records of people's activities, whether they're online, for your safety. Did it work? And the unfortunate reality is when we looked at the facts, long after the reporting was completed, January of 2014, people appointed by the president himself, one of my harshest critics, said that not only was this program in fact unlawful, and it should end, but it had never been effective for more than 10 years of operation, despite telling us if people knew about this, if they knew the secret, if it got out, lives would be lost, these journalists would have blood on their hands. They found that they could not identify a single instance where not only a life had been saved, not only a terrorist plot had been thwarted, but a single instance where this kind of mass surveillance, the telephony program, had made a concrete difference in any kind of counterterrorism investigation. This is the same thing when it comes to leaks of emails or political reasons or whatever. I don't trust them. Right? Don't look at this scheming agenda at the first glance. Look at what they say. Go to the source, follow it up, pursue it, doubt it, challenge it, test it. And what you come away with at the end, that's what matters. Because those are the facts.
In the interest of time, I'll transfer you over to Lethbridge and our colleagues there.
So another question that many of the people in the audience have is to ask you to reflect on the paradox that you've been given asylum in a country that if you had done there what you did in the United States, you wouldn't have been given the same welcome that you were given. So to reflect a little bit on the situation you're in versus those of citizens in Russia.
Yeah, it's one of the great illustrating dynamics of what happened is that whistleblowers are never safe in their country of action, right? It doesn't matter whether you do it in the United States, doesn't matter whether you do it in Russia, in China, France, Germany, even in Canada, right? If you embarrass those in power, particularly in relation to issues secrets, right? Classified information, regardless of whether it was right or wrong, regardless of whether the courts ruled that what you revealed was unlawful, which is the case in the United States. Let's be clear. The federal courts in the United States that examined these programs found that they were unlawful, they were unconstitutional. They have since been overturned as a result of these disclosures. The president that once supported them backed away from the call for an. The Congress in the United States, which can't ever get anything right, can't pass even the most necessary bills, came together in extraordinary form and passed the first significant surveillance reforms in more than 40 years in the United States as a result of these disclosures. Despite that, in that same country, I'm still a wanted man. This does not make Russia any greater a champion of human rights than it was the day before. Their record there is more than troubled, to say the least. And you know, people aren't so familiar with this, but I've actually been one of the most prominent critics since I've been in Russia of their surveillance abuses and their interference in shall we say, people's ability to choose who and how they love, right? The prohibition on gay marriage, they call it homosexual propaganda and things like that. I say, it doesn't matter whether it's in the United States, Russia, or anywhere else, government should not be regulating human emotion. They shouldn't be telling people how to love one another, how to express their feelings, particularly within the privacy of their own homes, their own communities, the streets that they walk down every day. This is not only wrong, it's repugnant, and it's something that should be condemned. And yet, despite this, people focus on the fact that Russia has a poor rights reputation, and it's true. But when they do protect a dissident's rights, should they be condemned for that, or should we recognize at least they did something right? Should we encourage people for when they get things right or wrong? I never chose to be in Russia. I applied for asylum in more than 21 different countries around the world, one of which I believe was Canada, primarily in Western Europe. None of them permitted me to come. Only Latin American countries said they would respond favorably, and as soon as the United States government heard that the government of Bolivia was planning to let me travel, they grounded the diplomatic plane of the president of Bolivia, Evo Morales, based on nothing more than a rumor that I was on board. Now, mind you, this is a flagrant violation of international law. Imagine someone down Air Force One with President Trump. But this illustrates the fundamental thing, which is it's not about Russia. It's not about the United States. This is about the nature of the embarrassed great powers. What we need is not to go, let's condemn this actor, that actor. We need to create a structure in which people can tell the truth about dangerous topics, right? In ways that can be adjudicated properly, fairly. I've told the United States government I would be happy to face a trial in the United States on one condition. I would volunteer myself for certainty, certain prison sentence, on a single condition, and that is that they guarantee a fair trial, meaning that I can tell the jury why I did what I did. People don't know this, but in the United States, I am prohibited from telling the jury why it is that I gave journalists this information. And that, I think, is quite sad, but this brings us back to that whole thing of, all right, if we have a Russian whistleblower, they'll be facing just as much trouble in Russia. In fact, they may just end up in a ditch, right? Or for Chinese whistleblowers, the same thing. We need an international mechanism for adjudicating these kind of claims, right? Where a neutral platform, neutral country, neutral state can look at these claims and actually decide the only thing that truly matters. Were these disclosures in the public interest? If they were, this individual should be protected, and their government should agree to recognize that decision. If they're not, they should face some criminal sanction. I'm not asking for a free pass. I don't think anyone should say that they shouldn't take any risk for decisions they make when they are impactful. But to say that because you're in a country that another country disagrees with, I don't recognize your cause, I don't support you or anything like that. I would say people who are engaged in that kind of thinking were unlikely to ever be defending civil liberties to begin with. Because rights, again, are not needed in the easy cases, but in the hard ones.
Mr. Snowden, not only governments and corporations are rapacious users of covert analysis gathering and analysis, there's also organized crime and terrorists. These are very real threats against which our governments are rightly engaged in fighting. Privacy for them is a tool that threatens the Constitution too. How do we keep our freedoms from becoming their freedoms?
The same way they were, just through targeted method of investigation. Traditionally, and again, remember, I worked at the CIA and the NSA. I've actually read terrorist communications. I know what the threats are, and I've never said, let's shut down the NSA, let's shut down the FBI. That's not my position. I am a critic of mass surveillance, indiscriminate, untargeted surveillance that goes beyond what is necessary and proportionate to the threat presented by these adversaries, right? And we've seen, you earlier saw an example of that's the Washington Post reporting on the President's Commission evaluating mass surveillance. Mass surveillance has no record of saving lives in the United States. Right? And that's replicated in every other country that I'm aware of that's studied these issues in a real meaningful way rather than spin, where they're conflating the target programs. Which leads us to an inevitable conclusion. Right? Whenever we face a controversy, a difficult balancing act, we should be using the most effective and least intrusive means of investigation. This is the foundation of all historical police work that's considered to be a model that we want to emulate. This means, therefore, when you think there's somebody in Winnipeg who's up to no good, police are trying to see who this person's talking to and what they're doing and all these things, you don't deploy a stingray, which is a mass surveillance device. For those who aren't familiar with it, a stingray is basically a fake cell phone tower. You've got the real legitimate ones here and here that have all these cell phones connected to it. A stingray is a fake, louder cell phone tower that detaches all the cell phones from these legitimate ones and forces them through them. Doesn't matter whether you're grandma talking about her cookie recipe or whether you're actually a terrorist planning some kind of attack, you're all going to get sucked into this dragnet. Rather, instead, they should do what they've always done, which is go to a court, show that they have probable cause that this individual is suspected of a crime. The court, particularly in cases of terrorism, I know this firsthand, and everyone knows this from established history, no court is going to go, oh, well, this individual looks like quite the terrorist, and they're going to be really worried about their rights, so we're not going to let you go after them. A judge who's looking at a serious terrorism case, even if it's got reasonably thin evidence against it, is going to stamp that warrant so fast it's going to leave an imprint in the desk. The police will then go after this individual and this individual alone. They will, for example, compromise that individual's phone to bypass the kind of encryption that we were talking about before that protects against mass surveillance, right? Where the phone companies are trying to steal things off the wires that transit between phones, and instead go after the individual bad phone itself. This is analogous to how in earlier days, with less technology, when they wanted to tap, let's say, an organized criminal boss's communications to know what they're up to, they didn't have a magic easy button where they said, oh, well, let's just get everything off of Facebook, let's get everything off of Google, because these kind of centralized repositories didn't exist. But they could still get the same kind of information about what this person's communications were by bugging their office, by bugging their phone, by bugging their car. The individualized, targeted means of conveyance, either for the individual physically or for their information. We know this works. This works, plots every day in every country. It has a well-established history of working. Why are we not doing that? And then this, therefore, calls into question, well, governments aren't stupid, right? At least we'd like to presume that. It's the contrary, almost comedic under circumstances. So why is mass surveillance pursued at all? Because mass surveillance is about saving lives, and it never has been. Mass surveillance is justified on the basis of counterterrorism because counterterrorism is the only threat dire to counter all opposing arguments. It is the only thing that can make people stop thinking about the issue, think about the violations, I go, okay, as long as it saves lives, as long as it's going to keep us safe, I'll go with it. Even if politicians are skeptical of these proposals, because they don't want to be seen as soft on terrorism. They don't want to be seen as the person who voted against this program that's going to save the children, right? But now we have evidence. Now we know those programs don't work. And when we look back at what these programs actually are useful for, and we have story after story that's been published since 2013, establishing this. We've had study after study establishing this. Mass surveillance is very effective for other things. Economic espionage, diplomatic manipulation, social influence, and ultimately control. These things, mass surveillance is great for. Imagine if you had a bucket of everyone in the world's communications. Could you find something interesting in there? Could you find a use for that? Certainly. But it's necessarily retrospective, right? You don't know who's interesting until after they've done something, which is why it's not effective, or why it's not effective in the terrorism context. Whenever we see these stories of somebody doing a mass shooting, engaged in terrorist activity, the Boston bombers plot in the United States, these groups, these individuals are often known to law enforcement, right? But they say we weren't watching this guy. We didn't have eyes on him because they were distracted by all of the other targets. Mass surveillance actually blinds us. It is this shiny object that when I was working at NSA, right, I would come in the morning, I would see all of the results for all of the people that I was looking at, right? And half my day would be looking through completely normal, innocuous internet traffic or low-value things simply because it was there, it was automated, it was available. The hard, old-fashioned police work that's actually effective, that actually saves lives, becomes far less attractive when you have something that seems interesting, that provides a lot of reach, but doesn't provide a lot of ultimate capability, a lot of ultimate outcome. Now, there are those in the audience who may still be skeptical, right? And they go, well, diplomatic manipulation, economic espionage may not be, particularly moral, but it sounds fine. You know, spy, let them do it. That's what I pay them for. I want them to gain a national advantage. That's an okay position to have. Right? But when we debate these programs, when we debate these policies, when these issues are before Parliament, these are the conversations we should be having. These are the controversies we should be discussing. These are the values that we should be weighing and measuring. These are the arguments we should be challenging and testing. Not waving our hands and going, oh, if you don't agree with me, you are going to kill people. And there's no evidence whatsoever to establish this. These programs are not about public safety. They're about power. Whether you're for or against that is up to you. But that's the conversation we should have.
Thank you again, Mr. Snowden. I'll send it back to Dr. Lord.
Well, thank you. That concludes the question and answer portion of the evening. I'd like to thank Mr. Snowden for his wide-ranging, insightful, and inspiring talk. It really calls to mind your countryman's dictum, Thomas Jefferson, that the price of freedom or liberty is eternal vigilance, particularly against the myriad of powers that you were outlining for us. I'd also like to extend a special thanks at this point to the various technical teams here at UW, at Lethbridge, at